Year 8s can, but you won't be tested on it. Okay, so hopefully you all had a nice Easter break. If you go to the website and you click on GCSE Biology Paper 1 and go down to Organization and the Digestive System, because if you're year 9, you're going to be tested in this next 2 weeks. I've already put an assessment on Show My Homework on the digestive system. I just want to get through 2 lessons of content today, so you have a better understanding to be able to do the test. Okay, so last we left off was we covered tissues and organs, and we also covered the different organ systems. And now we're going to move on to digestive system structure. So just to give you an idea of where we're at, first I want to start off with just a picture of the digestive system structure. So all the organs and all the parts that are involved, you are going to have to know the placements of everything for you to have an idea of the pathway of food as it moves through the digestive system. So just to start off, we have this diagram here of our digestive system. And just back from Key Stage 3, and even probably back from primary school, you may already have some knowledge of where things are at. Like, you can probably already label some of these things yourselves. I just want to give you some time now to think about any organs that you recognize, any parts that you think you already recognize. So the very first thing that we're going to label is the mouth. That's the start of the digestive system. And in the mouth, we have these glands that are right by here, and they produce saliva. We call these glands the salivary glands. So saliva, aka spit. After that, it moves down your, the common word is the gullet, but the scientific word for this is the esophagus. Now careful on the spelling, it's Oesophagus. After the food goes down the esophagus, it enters into the stomach. Travels through the stomach into the bit in the middle here. This is the small intestine. Then loops through into the large intestine. And then it goes out through, well, it's first stored in the rectum, and then any waste leaves through the anus. But notice that we missed out 2 lines here, and that's because you do have to understand that these 2 parts, they are part of the digestive system. They play a very important role in the digestive system, but food doesn't actually go through them. So I'm going to do a different color because these organs are special. They are part of the digestive system, but the food doesn't actually pass through. Now the first one that I want to talk about is this left one here that I'm going to shade in. This is the liver. And there's a little bit off here that's near the liver called the gallbladder. So there's the liver and the gallbladder on the left side, and then on the right side here, this organ that I'm shading in. Once again, food does not go through it, but it does play a very important part. This is known as the pancreas. So, in terms of what you have to memorize and what you have to know, those are the organs that you do have to know when it comes to the digestive system. Once again, you do have to know the pathway of food, the pathway that food takes through the digestive system. But there are two other sets involved. Well, technically three if you count liver and gallbladder as two separate organs. There are three other organs involved, but food doesn't actually pass through them. So I have them in different colors. Now, we have to talk about what these organs actually do. So we know where they are now, where they're located, we know the pathway. Now we're going to talk about what they actually do. Now the end goal of this, because I know there's a lot of information, is I want you guys by the end to be able to describe the pathway of food through the digestive system. What happens, what gets broken down, when does it get broken down, what breaks it down. So if say you ate a ham and cheese toastie, you would be able to give a description of everything that happens to that ham and cheese toastie as it moves through your body. That's the end goal here. Now there's going to be quite a few keywords involved, but a lot of these keywords are not like brand new. They would have all been things that you may have heard of before, especially if you watch any like doctor shows or anything like that. You would have heard these words before, even if you didn't really know what they meant exactly. Okay, so what I have in the notes organizer is I've divided the processes down to organize it as much as possible. Because if you look at the Kerboodle textbook, it's just blocks of text, blocks of information. So I've tried to divide it down as much as possible for you via processes. So the very first process that happens as you eat your food is the eating part, right? You're ingesting it. Ingestion is basically just our scientific keyword to say we're taking something in, we're eating something. So where we ingest this, obviously, is we ingest things through our mouth. Now here's the very first sort of key, well I should say key phrase, not key word, that we're going to be talking about is mechanical digestion. Normally, when we think of digestion, we think of it breaking down chemically, like in our stomach, in our small intestine, but we start off by breaking it down just by breaking it apart into tiny pieces, not through chemicals, but through chewing. So that's what we mean by mechanical. It's like breaking it down manually, not chemically. So mechanical digestion, what I would say about what that means, just to start you off, is it is chewing. So it's chewing food. And if we want to think about why we need to chew food in the first place, well, if we break it up into smaller pieces, it makes it a lot easier to go down our esophagus, our gullet, and it also makes it easier for chemical digestion to happen later, right? Everyone here has accidentally swallowed food before chewing it enough, and it really hurts when it's going down. So chewing food to break into smaller pieces. At that point, we can't absorb that really yet because it's not really fully broken down into small enough pieces. Remember, we want it broken down to a microscopic level so our body can like actually absorb it. This point is just mechanical digestion, is just making it easier for the later processes to happen. Now, the second part of ingestion is when we coat our food with our spit, our saliva. Now, saliva, it wets the food. That would make it go down easier. And it also contains enzymes. And this enzyme is called amylase. It's spelled like Amy Lace. What this means is basically, even though we're chewing the food and mechanically digesting it to start off with by breaking it down, we also have a little bit of chemical breakdown using our saliva. So when our saliva coats our food, our saliva actually contains what's known as this enzyme. An enzyme is basically something that chemically can break things down for us. So it's like this protein that can break things down for us. You can think of it like a pair of scissors, a specialized pair of scissors that can cut things up. And specifically, this enzyme breaks down starch into sugars. Now this bit is very interesting because you can actually test this out right now if you have bread in the house. I'm going to give you a little bit of time for those of you with bread in the house to actually go and do this. It works best with white bread because with things like brown bread or like flavored bread, the flavor might be a little bit too the flavor of the bread might be a bit too strong and might hide what's going on. But if you have white bread, you take a little bit of it and you put it in your mouth, you wet it with saliva, but you don't swallow it just yet. You just coat it with saliva, maybe give it like a minute. The bread will actually start to taste very sweet because the starch in the bread gets broken down by the amylase enzyme in your mouth. The starch gets broken down into sugars, and then your tongue processes that sugar into making it taste sweet. So if you get some bread now, some white bread, just a little bit, pinch some off, put it in your mouth, wet it with your saliva, but don't swallow it just yet, you'll eventually taste that sweetness. And that is due to the amylase enzyme that is in your saliva. Okay, so after the ingestion process where we chew the food, we wet it, we digest it chemically a little bit, well, just the starch. It then goes down our esophagus. And when it goes down our esophagus, there's a process known as peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is basically how our food moves down the esophagus because our esophagus is a muscular tube. It's not just like a regular tube, it's lined with muscle. So it pushes and squeezes the food down. And that process is known as peristalsis. And this is the reason why, and if you ever test this, this is the reason why that you can actually swallow upside down. I remember when I realized you can swallow upside down because way back when I was in primary school, because I was like hanging upside down on something in the like playground, the play yard, I was hanging upside down and I was chewing on a piece of gum and then I accidentally swallowed that gum upside down. And I remember thinking, hang on, how is that possible? But the reason why it's possible is because it's not, your esophagus is not just some tube that food falls through, it's actively squeezed through. It's actively squeezed through. So even if you're upside down, the muscles in your esophagus end up pushing the food through into your stomach. And your stomach, that is where further chemical digestion happens. Now, there's a lot of common misconceptions about the stomach. Okay, so I'm going to try to be as clear as possible about what those misconceptions are. And the biggest misconception is the function of acid. Now, most of you guys probably know that our stomach is filled with hydrochloric acid. We have hydrochloric acid in our stomach, and the biggest misconception here that people think is the function of that acid is to break down the food. But that's not what the hydrochloric acid is for. The enzymes break down the food. The acid is just to help with that breakdown. So just to start off with, what the stomach is basically an organ. It's also got muscular walls, so the walls that are lining the stomach are very muscular, and this helps churn the food. So muscular walls. Now, when your stomach is growling, you can hear that happen. So your stomach is constantly churning the food, but when your stomach is empty or when it's growling, you can actually hear that churning process. If you get a sibling or your parent or something, if you're comfortable with this, to put their ear to your stomach, or if you do this to someone else, like if you put your ear up to someone in your house's stomach, you can actually hear their stomach because it's constantly moving. It's churning the food. It's churning. Now, it also contains that hydrochloric acid, and the function of it, first things first, it's to kill bacteria. Oh, I think my sound just went. No, there we go. So the function of hydrochloric acid is to kill bacteria. That's the number one thing that it does. So if there's any sort of nasty things that are about to come through, say you didn't really properly wash your vegetables and there's bacteria on it, most of it's okay. The hydrochloric acid in your stomach is the reason why the 5-second rule exists. If there was no acid in your stomach to kill the bacteria, the second your food hit the ground or hit somewhere where there's a lot of bacteria, it would just be not okay to eat whatsoever, because we don't have any defense systems against that bacteria. But thankfully our hydrochloric acid is there, and it also makes it so that a low pH, remember pH is a measure of how acidic something is, so the more acidic something is, the better the enzymes work. I'm going to say better working environment for enzymes. Our enzymes, such as amylase in our body, work best in low pH. Well, actually, not amylase, but some of the enzymes in our stomach work best in low pH. And specifically, that enzyme that works best at low pH is protease. Protease, you can gather from its name what kind of food it breaks down. Protease breaks down protein. So when you eat a piece of chicken and it goes down into your stomach, first any bacteria is killed by the hydrochloric acid, and also the protease is what breaks down that piece of chicken. The acid makes it so that the protease can do the best job possible, because protease likes to work at low pH. Now, we're going to move on to the liver. So, once again, remember that the food doesn't actually go through the liver at all. The liver is on the outside of the main digestive system pathway. So, but they still play the liver still plays a very important role. The main role that it plays is that it's sort of like what helps remove toxins. So removes toxins. For example, alcohol is a toxin in our body, and basically, if you drink alcohol, the liver is the organ that's responsible for breaking that down and removing it from our body. That's why if people abuse alcohol, like they drink it far too often, the main consequence of that doctors are worried about is liver failure. So if people like overwork their liver by over drinking, by drinking too much, that would be then a huge problem. Another thing that the liver does for our digestive system, besides just removing toxins, is it also makes something called bile. First thing that we have to know about this substance called bile is that it is an alkali. Now think back to year 7 when you learn about acids and alkalis. Alkalis are the opposites of acids. So because our food just like is in the stomach and it's about to leave the stomach and go into the small intestine, it's coming into the small intestine very, very acidic. But our small intestine doesn't really have the protection from that acid that our stomach does. So we're going to need to neutralize that acidic stuff first, right? So once again, food from the stomach goes into small intestine. And because it just left the stomach, it's very, very acidic. Our small intestine does not have the protection against that strong acid. So we want to neutralize it first. And that's where bile comes in. Bile is what neutralizes the acid that is coming from the stomach to go into the small intestine. And it also breaks fat into small droplets. Breaks down fat. It doesn't actually digest fat, so it doesn't chemically break it down. Its main thing is that, like, I have a picture here as an example. If you have like a large drop of oil or a large chunk of fat, the bile just sort of breaks it down into smaller droplets, so that way the enzymes in your body later can break it down a bit easier. Now, the bile, after it gets made in the liver, it's stored by the gallbladder. And then the gallbladder then releases bile into the small intestine. Because this, like at the start of the small intestine, we want that bile there to neutralize that acid from the stomach. Okay. So, gallbladder to the small intestine, the bile from the gallbladder to the small intestine. And then there's another organ, remember, that is not part of the main pathway but still involved. The pancreas also adds things into the small intestine. So you may have heard of the pancreas before in the context of the enzymes that it produces. In terms of insulin. So the pancreas is the main organ that controls our blood sugar. So people with diabetes usually have something wrong with their pancreas. But there's another function of the pancreas that you may have not learned before, and that it produces enzymes. Makes enzymes. But these enzymes that break down food, remember, food doesn't actually pass through the pancreas, so it needs to send them somewhere. So it makes the enzymes and sends them to the small intestine at the same time that the bile is coming through from the gallbladder. So food from stomach goes into the small intestine, and as that happens, we have the liver and gallbladder and the pancreas all sending the materials they make into the small intestine to support the small intestine. So small intestine is where the food is, but then you have the liver and gallbladder and pancreas sending materials there to help with digestion. So the liver and the gallbladder send in the bile. The bile helps with neutralizing the acid and breaking down fat into smaller drops. And the pancreas sends in some enzymes. And the small intestine is where more digestion happens because of the enzymes. Now the enzymes first is we have carbohydrates, which from the name you can tell it breaks down carbohydrates. It has lipase, which breaks down fat or lipids, and we have protease again. So all of the food groups are covered now. We have carbohydrates, fats, and protein all getting broken down. Small intestine doesn't actually make the enzymes itself. Remember, that's the pancreas. It's just where it actually happens. The enzymes get sent to the small intestine. Now, finally, we're going to talk about what happens after it gets broken down. So we've just finished talking about how everything got broken down, the whole process, starting from the mouth where mechanical digestion happens, a little bit of chemical digestion happens because the amylase breaks starch into sugar, then it goes down our esophagus, gets to our stomach where bacteria is killed and protein is digested, and then food goes to our small intestine where bile from the liver and gallbladder come in to break fat down into smaller droplets and neutralize the acid from the stomach, and the pancreas sends in some enzymes for more digestion to happen at the start of the small intestine. Now, all of the food is fully digested. We've digested, we've broken down our food. Now the second part of the digestive system is after we've broken it all down, we've got to absorb it. So now we're going to talk about what happens when we absorb all of these nutrients. Okay, so when we talk about absorption, the main thing we want to talk about is the intestines. The small intestine is where we absorb all the nutrients such as like the fats, the sugars, all of that. So all the actual foodstuffs our small intestine absorbs. Our large intestine reabsorbs water. So nutrient absorption. Basically, any foods that have now been broken down so small to the point where they can actually be dissolved in water, we call that soluble. So soluble means that it can be dissolved in water, get absorbed into the blood. That's why we want it as small as possible, because if it was like a large chunk, it's probably not going to be easily dissolved. And the reason why we want it to be easily be dissolved is because, remember, we're carrying all of these nutrients in our blood. Our blood is liquid, so we want it to be able to be dissolved into our blood to make it easy for us to carry it around. So soluble substances gets absorbed into the blood, and it happens by passing through the walls of the small intestine. So all the food is inside the small intestine, and to leave the small intestine, it leaves the wall of the small intestine. So in order for this to happen, like as best as possible, we have some features that we need to make sure our small intestine has. Well, first of all, we need to make sure that we have a constant blood supply, right? Because, well, if we are absorbing food into our blood, dissolving food into our blood, we want a good blood supply to make diffusion faster. Same with the reason why we want thin walls of the small intestine, because if the walls were really, really thick, diffusion of our food pass through into the blood is going to take a long time. So we want to make sure the walls are thin as well, so the diffusion distance, how far the food has to go to travel, is really, really small. And the way it helps, another thing that helps is increasing the surface area. So more space for food to pass through. If we have more sections where diffusion can happen, well, then more diffusion will happen, more food gets absorbed. So we have these structures inside the small intestine known as villi and microvilli, and they kind of look like little fingers, and basically it's like the small intestine wall gets folded like so. So we have, like, if you imagine, this is sort of the inside foods passing through. There's loads of spots along the wall now where diffusion can happen for it to pass through into the bloodstream. And microvilli is basically villi on villi. You can think of it like if your fingers grew additional fingers around it, that would be the microvilli. So it's like each one of these also have villi on them. And this is all, remember, just to increase the amount of space for diffusion to happen. So the more area where diffusion can happen, the more diffusion happens, the more food we absorb. And then we have water absorption. So water absorbed also into the blood. So that when you have like an upset stomach and you get diarrhea, that's because the food gets like passed through so quickly, so it passes through the large intestine. Your large intestine doesn't get a chance to really absorb the water back, and that's why it looks like runny, because it passes through the large intestine so quickly. But what normally should happen, the reason why you have solid waste, is because of that water that gets absorbed through the large intestine. And now finally, we're excreting it. So we're started off with ingestion, then digestion, then absorption, and then now we're moving on to excretion. And excretion is basically what we call just getting rid of any waste that we don't want. So anything that's not absorbed, anything that's not broken down and absorbed by our body, gets sent back out. And we call that solid waste feces. So the rectum is our storage area. So imagine if we didn't have a rectum, right? The second we like finish our meal and it passes through our digestive system, passes through our large intestine, and it just comes out without any warning. I mean, that'd be a terrible world to live in. That'd be terrible. Everyone would have to wear diapers all the time. So, thankfully, we have a rectum that allows us to store our feces someplace until we are ready to go to the bathroom. And our anus is the actual ring of muscle that pushes out feces. So, on a test, I don't want you guys to use your own words for this. I want you guys to use a proper scientific terminology, okay? So we call it the anus, not anything else. And it's basically the ring of muscle that just helps with pushing out the feces, because remember, it is solid waste, so it's not going to be as easy to get out. Okay, so in terms of our practice, you guys already have on Show My Homework the assessment that I've put up for you guys. We haven't fully covered everything to do with the digestive system yet on live stream, just due to time, but you do have access to Kerboodle, and all of these notes pages I have made tailored as much as possible to Kerboodle, so then you can sort of, because I recognize with Kerboodle it might be a bit difficult because it's like you're looking through Kerboodle, it's this textbook with blocks of text, and making sense of it, organizing it into some way you can understand might be a bit difficult. So these notes organizers that I have tailored to Kerboodle will help you with, as you're reading through the textbook, you can fill it in yourself as well. Okay, so I've tried to support you guys as much as possible in this so that you would be able to gather as much information on your own. So any bits that I have not been able to cover, if you want to get the test assessment done as soon as you can try to use Kerboodle yourself. Okay? The main things that we haven't covered yet is basically the chemistry of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and exactly how enzymes work. So those are the bits that haven't been covered just yet. If you wait a bit, if you wait until tomorrow, we can cover it. But the main thing is if you want to do the test straight away, you can do. And you can also use Seneca for some additional practice. Make sure you are using Seneca and make sure you are using Educake. Okay? I also have on the website additional resources for you to have a look at for some extra practice. So if you click on Lesson 2, the digestive system, and I have some 2 worksheets for you guys to have a look at. I'll be putting the answers up, actually. That should go up in maybe about 20 minutes time. If it's not up straight away, just check back. You don't have to send this in or anything. This is just some additional practice for those of you who really want to fully be confident in your understanding of the digestive system. Okay? So the main 2 sheets there, one is focusing on all the different parts of the digestive system, one is focusing on how absorption works, why surface area matters, things like that. Okay, so that is the end of today's stream. I do have a meeting later on, so I have to cut this short in terms of like coming back and checking your guys' answers. But I will put the answers up on the website as soon as I possibly can. I'll get started on that straight away as soon as we end, just so then you guys would be able to be confident in what you're doing. So when we come back, whenever we come back, you guys will be fine with the digestive system, okay? And there's no backlog of work or anything like that. So that's it. Hopefully, you guys had a nice Easter break, and I will see you soon.